Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking History. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you're all keeping well. So we have made it. We have finished off the Norman period, which I finished off with the second part of Empress Matilda. So this week we are in the Plantagenets. We have made it, and we are going to talk about none other than the man himself, Henry II. And this is going to be part one of several videos. There is a lot to get through. There was a lot that happened during Henry's reign, and I want to make sure I cover everything, and I want everyone who was involved in during the reign to have their story told. So there's going to be a lot. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of those upcoming videos. But I lost my train of thought. So until, oh my God, until then, let's get into the video. Oh, it's going to be one of those days again, isn't it? Henry was born on the 5th of March in 1153 at Le Mans, yeah. And he was the eldest son born to Empress Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou. When Henry was around 2 years old, his mother would become in a long battle for the English throne, which would become known as the Anarchy, with her cousin Stephen, although Stephen had sworn his allegiance to Matilda twice before the death of her father, King Henry I. Henry's first taste of life in England happened when he was around 9 years old. In 1142, he joined his uncle Robert of Gloucester from Normandy to England, and he would go on to stay at Bristol with Robert, where he was tutored. He would remain with Robert at Bristol for around 15 months, and Henry had arrived in England shortly after his mother made her infamous escape from Oxford Castle in 1141. Henry would be called back to Normandy in 1144 when his father Geoffrey had been officially named Duke of Normandy. Henry witnessed his father's charters in 1144, and he witnessed how a military campaign started and carried out. Henry knew that he was being prepared for Duke of Normandy, and it's quite possible that he was whilst he was at his father's side, that he became a keen rider, as he spent many hours on horseback following his father Geoffrey around Normandy and Anjou. Henry would become known for being a fast horse rider. In later years, his legs would become bowed through many years spent in the saddle. By now, Henry knew that he needed to be more than just another powerful lord or duke. After all, he was the son of the daughter of King Henry I, who was the rightful heir to England and Normandy. In 1147, at the age of just 13 years old, Henry travelled from Normandy to England with a group of mercenaries. There's just a few men. Although he was brave, it was a brave move to do, but it was also incredibly reckless. And the arrival of the teenage Henry, Matilda's son. Bear in mind, England was still in the grips of civil war. It brought utter terror to England, and rumours were quickly spreading that the young Henry, had brought thousands of troops and boundless treasure, and loads and loads of arms and all this and that. But the truth was, it was a 13-year-old boy who may have thought that he was helping his mother out when in fact it could have caused more trouble than good. And he also had no money. He had no money to pay his men, so a lot of his men abandoned him within the first few weeks. And then Henry was like, I can't get home. I don't know how to get home. So he turned to his mother, Empress Matilda, who basically said, not a chance. Nope. You caused the mess, you can clean it up. And then he went to his uncle, Robert of Gloucester, and he also said, no, no, go swivel. And so Henry turned to Stephen. Now, Stephen, being the man he was, of good nature and quite chivalrous, really, he agreed. He paid Stephen's and paid Henry's men off, quite possibly more to get them out of the way, to be honest. Just probably like, here's the money, go bugger off back. And he paid for Henry to return back to Normandy. So, yeah, it was, like I say, it was a bit of a reckless move, but he was only a teenage boy, and he may have thought he was giving his mum a hand. But in all fairness, it does show how strong Henry's nature was at a young age. But Henry's blood was of Norman, Saxon, and Angevin. And within seconds, Henry could go from good humour to fierce anger. Remind you of another Henry? Back in the future. Henry had his father's auburn hair and tireless energy. From his maternal grandfather, King Henry, he had a powerful, domineering streak, and he knew a good opportunity when he saw one. Now, Gerald of Wales had described Henry as, quote, Henry II was a man of reddish, freckled complexion with a large round head, grey eyes that glowed fiercely and grew bloodshot in anger, a fiery countenance and a harsh, cracked voice. His neck was thrust forward slightly from his shoulders, his chest was broad and square, his arms strong and powerful, his body was stocky with a pronounced tendency towards fatness, due to nature rather than self-indulgence, which he tempered with exercise. For eating and drinking he was moderately sparing. In 1149, Henry travelled to Scotland, where he was knighted by his great-uncle, King David I. In August 1151, Henry and his father travelled to Paris, where Henry was formally invested as the Duke of Normandy by the French King Louis VII, where they met a certain Eleanor of Aquitaine, who apparently was quite taken with the father and son. In September that same year, when they was travelling back, Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, died at the age of 38. In 1152, King Louis VII had divorced his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, Eleanor had written to Henry, who was in Normandy, with a wedding proposal. 6 weeks later, on the 18th of May 1152, the 19-year-old Duke Henry of Normandy, really itchy nose, married the 28-year-old Eleanor in a low-key ceremony at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Eleanor, she was known for her beauty and her potent sexuality and her headstrong personality. Only 2 months previously, she had been Queen of France. Now, to her marriage to Henry, Eleanor brought wealth, power, and lands. Eleanor's marriage to Henry changed everything. Henry now had the control of Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and now Aquitaine. Henry controlled almost the entire western seaboard of the kingdom and almost half of the landed territory. King Louis, he was not a happy bunny. Yes, he had expected for Eleanor to remarry. After all, she was a very beautiful woman. Why wouldn't she want to remarry? But I don't think he expected her to marry Henry. And also, what also riled him up was the fact Henry and Eleanor married without seeking his permission first. So, not only did Louis have his marriage to Eleanor annulled, Eleanor then quickly married the young and powerful Duke of Normandy, who through the marriage owned more lands than the French king. And to throw salt into the wounds, Eleanor quickly fell pregnant. On January the 16th, 1153, Henry arrived back in England. Although Henry didn't think of England as his home at this point, he understood the English language, but he didn't speak it. And when Henry arrived in England, he was in Malmesbury in Wiltshire. The weather was awful. It was wet. It was freezing cold. And Henry arrived with an invading force of 140 knights and 3,000 men who were all fully armed up to the teeth. Henry had seen what the anarchy had done to England. At Malmesbury, it had been seized and brutalized several times during the Civil War. Henry now stood outside the walls, ready to destroy what remained. The townspeople fled, terrified, to the church, and once Henry and his men was inside the church was plundered, and the priests and monks were murdered. Now, King Stephen, he was expecting Henry's arrival, but he didn't think that Henry would attack Malmesbury. Stephen and his forces were at Wallingford, so he had expected Henry to join them there, which was some 60 miles away, but Henry, he refused to move, so Stephen had a large army and they made their way along that 60-mile route to Malmesbury. But Stephen's army had very little faith left in their leader. Stephen's army was drenched and freezing cold, and they refused to fight. The Civil War had gone on for way too long. They had had enough. The terrible weather conditions, it would make the fight treacherous, and they weren't prepared. They weren't prepared to fight anymore. So King Stephen, he had a mutiny on his hands and he retreated. The English barons, they were beginning to turn towards Henry. And Henry, though, he had quickly realized that the mercenaries he brought with him were in fact spreading fear across the country, which it wasn't his intentions. He wanted to build trust. So the barons had suggested that he send some of his men back home to Normandy, and Henry listened. So Henry sent 500 men back to Normandy. But as they sailed back across the channel, a massive storm hit them and all 500 men were drowned. The last thing Henry wanted to do was to make more war on a kingdom that was just exhausted. Henry made peaceful overtures to the powerful magnates and the barons and the bishops under the guidance of Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury. Negotiations were beginning. As the barons slowly joined the young duke, the most powerful baron to join was Robert, Earl of Leicester. He and his twin Walawan, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce that, they were part of the elite nobility, and they both had been loyal to Stephen for many years. And Leicester, he was a powerful landowner in the Midlands, which is my area. So he gave Henry a vital advantage. Robert brought fighting experience, and he would prove to be one of Henry's most loyal and trusted men for the rest of his life. In the spring 1153, Henry toured England. He visited Bristol and Gloucester. He slowly made his way through the violent Midlands, where an uneasy peace was reached with the magnates. The Midlands was the failure of Stephen's reign. Authority was pretty much non-existent. Henry, he promoted good lordship, and instead of ravaging the lands, he held court across the country. He invited the men to come to him in peace. Henry had guaranteed legal rights to the lands of the magnates instead of burning their crops, not only in England but also in Normandy. Henry was gaining the support from the community, but he knew battle could not be completely avoided. In July 1153, Henry met Stephen at Wallingford, which was a town by the Thames close to Westminster and London. King Stephen had the castle that was loyal to Henry under siege. Henry, he approached with a large army, and Stephen, he had been waiting, had then marched with his large army to meet Henry in early August. Now, once again, there was a refusal on both sides to fight. Everyone had enough of this civil war. They wanted it done. So Henry and Stephen agreed to talk, and a peace treaty had emerged. King Stephen, he had two sons, Eustace and William. Eustace was the older brother. He was 23 in 1153. Eustace, he had grown up knowing nothing but war, and he was always told that he was going to be King of England one day. And he was also encouraged to take part of the fighting. Eustace was his father's heir, which meant Henry was his arch enemy. Eustace had married Constance, who was King Louis's sister. Eustace allied himself with his brother-in-law and Geoffrey, who was Henry's younger brother, who had felt that Henry had cheated him out of his father's inheritance. After all, Henry had enough. So together, Eustace, Louis and Geoffrey had planned to wage war against the Duke. Eustace's position was weak, and he could lose everything through his father's treaty with Henry. Eustace had not yet been anointed as co-king, which was now becoming customary, and this had meant that Stephen could easily disinherit his son, so the treaty could be completed. Stephen could name Henry as his heir. Stephen's younger son, William, he wasn't so interested in the throne. So Eustace, he left his father's court furious, and he went on to burn and pillage crops, and just weeks after Eustace's outburst of violence, he fell ill and died in August 1153. Quite convenient, that. His death was believed to have been some bad food, although there were some that believed it was in fact poison. Stephen was heartbroken, but the truth was it made things a lot easier to continue with the peace treaty. Stephen had formally adopted Henry as his son and heir at Christmas in Westminster, 1153. Stephen and Henry, they began working together to rebuild the broken kingdom. The three main tasks were to suppress the violence, um, removing the hired mercenaries that flooded the country, and levelling the castles that had been built since Stephen's succession. There were still those that disagreed with the treaty, and in a meeting at Canterbury in March 1154, Henry was informed of a plot to have him murdered. It was believed that Stephen's youngest son, William, had actually known about the plot, and Henry decided to return to Normandy. While Stephen made progress to the north of England, getting his administrators to get a new coinage done, and Henry left England in March. So less than a year after signing the treaty, Henry was informed that King Stephen had died. Stephen died on the 25th of October 1154. He was in his early 60s. Stephen was buried at Faversham Abbey next to his beloved Queen Matilda and their son Eustace. Henry, he set sail for England on the 7th of December and was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 19th of December 1154. A heavily pregnant Eleanor was sat beside him. Theobald of Canterbury performed the ceremony. Henry was the first king to be crowned King of England over the old form, King of the English. England's new king was well educated, legally minded, and he was fluent in several languages, although Henry only spoke Latin and French, and he was addicted to hunting and hawking. Gerald of Wales describes Henry to be, quote, "He was addicted to the chase beyond measure. At crack of dawn he was often on horseback, traversing wastelands, penetrating forest, and climbing the mountain tops. So he passed restless days. At evening on his return home, he was rarely seen to sit down, either before after supper he would wear the whole court out by continuous standing. He was a man of easy access and condescending with witty, second to none in politeness, continuous in warfare, and very prudent in civil life. He was fierce towards those who remained untamed, but merciful towards the vanquished. Harsh to his servants, expansive towards strangers, prodigal in public, thrifty in private. He was diligent in guardian and maintaining peace, liberal beyond comparison in almsgiving, and defender to the Holy Land. A lover of humanity and a presser of the nobility and a container of the proud. Although Henry had invested heavily in magnificent castles and palaces, he rarely stayed anywhere for too long. Henry's travelling court was frequently described as disgusting and smelly and ratty, and the wine was said to be very vinegarish with bits in it that you had to filter. Not nice. So King Louis was amazed at how Henry could just simply pop up anywhere and everywhere around his territories without warning. He said it was as if he flew rather than rode on horseback. After Henry's coronation, though, he and his young family needed somewhere to live. At the time of Henry's coronation, their eldest son, William, was a little over a year old. A second son, Henry, was born on the 28th of February, 1155. Oh, he was a leap. No, that's 29th of February. Ignore me. Well, I was thinking he was a leap year baby, but he wasn't because that, yeah. Um, so while they were in the country, Eleanor and their two boys required somewhere to live. The Palace of Westminster was badly deteriorated after the Civil War in 1155, and the royal family moved to the Palace of Bermondsey, which was opposite the bank of the Thames. And from their new home, Eleanor was able to travel in and out of London when she pleased. Oh, crikey. Though London, it clearly agreed with Eleanor, as Eleanor was pregnant for a third time in June 1156. A daughter was born named Matilda after her grandmother. Although there was joy at the birth of a baby girl, there was also sadness. Their firstborn, William, who was described as a sickly child, died in 1156. He was only 3 years old. The young prince was buried with great dignity at the feet of his great-grandfather, Henry I. Eleanor and Henry would go on to have two more boys, Richard in September 1157 and Geoffrey, who was born almost a year later. There would be three more children that would survive infancy. Eleanor, who was born in 1162, Joan, born in 1165, and John in 1167. Henry was travelling his kingdom and he found time to indulge in his love of hunting, but he also became familiar with the best places to hold government and the chase. Henry loved the chase, not only for animals, by the way, he was also a womanizer. He could not leave women alone. He was forever unfaithful to Eleanor. So Henry knew he needed to work on building up his new kingdom after the anarchy had destroyed it. So Henry's first job was to stamp out the rebellions. He also made it clear that anything built after the reign of his grandfather Henry I was illegitimate unless it was reconfirmed by Henry himself. He also ordered that also all the castles, the towns, and the lands that had been granted by Stephen be returned, followed by the earldoms Stephen had given out to his supporters. Many of the confiscated lands were being returned to their original holders, but Henry, he made it clear that the lordship began with him. Everyone owed their position and possessions to him. In 1156, Henry was forced to leave England to deal with a rebellion in Anjou that was being led by his younger brother Geoffrey. Now, Geoffrey had believed that since his brother's rise in status as king, the lands of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine should be his. Henry had no intentions of sharing his lands. Geoffrey had already proven to be unloyal after joining sides with King Louis. Now, things got so serious between the brothers that their mother, Empress Matilda, intervened. She held a meeting on the 2nd of February in 1156 at Rouen. Henry, he met Geoffrey, their youngest brother William, and their aunt Sibylla, Countess of Flanders, to negotiate a deal. But Henry, he had already performed homage to King Louis to isolate Geoffrey from Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. He appealed to the new Pope Adrian IV, which, by the way, was the first and only English man to be anointed as Pope, which is just a little bit of useless information there for you. So he appealed to Adrian IV to be released from the oath that he swore to uphold his father's will. Henry was determined to hold on to his lands, and the meeting achieved nothing. Absolutely nothing. Geoffrey, he formally rebelled, and it only ended when the people of Nantes, I really hope that's right, and Lower Brittany had elected Geoffrey as their new count. Geoffrey, who now had a rich territory to call all his own, was happy. And peace held between the two brothers until Geoffrey's death in 1158. So in 1157, Henry took homage of Malcolm IV of Scotland at Peveril Castle, where he regained the northern counties of England that had originally been taken during the Civil War by King David. Henry exchanged them for the Earl of Huntingdon, which was a traditional Scottish honour. That same year, Henry travelled to Wales, hoping to re-establish the dominant position that in the south that had once been established by his predecessors. Henry, though, he was almost killed near Flint during a military exercise of the campaign. Henry, he also found the Welsh to be a fierce enemy, but the two Welsh princes, Owain of Gwynedd and Rhys ap Gruffydd, had submitted during a massive show of military strength. This freed Henry to use the Treaty of Military Force to claim the county of Nantes, which allowed him to expand his power into the Duchy of Brittany. In the same year, 1158, Henry had his eldest son, Henry, who I'm going to call Henry Jr. throughout, so deal with it, had him betrothed to King Louis's daughter, Margaret. Yes. Henry had his son, Henry, betrothed to his wife's ex-husband's daughter. It all happened in medieval times. You couldn't make it up. So a massive army was making its way towards the city of Toulouse in midsummer 1159. This was the largest army that Henry had ever managed to raise. Henry wanted to take Toulouse from his ruler, Count Raymond V, to add it to the Duchy of Aquitaine. Now, Eleanor of Aquitaine had a slightly stretched claim to Toulouse through her paternal grandmother after she had been passed over for inheritance in the 1090s. Now, in 1141, King Louis had tried to invade, much like Henry was doing then, but Louis was pushed back. However, Henry wasn't going to be discouraged. He felt he had a decent claim. The army included many great nobles. Malcolm IV of Scotland had joined, and somewhere deep in the middle of the army was the person who organised the campaign, the Chancellor of England, the Archdeacon of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. Toulouse was a very large city and it was extremely well protected. Henry threw everything he had at it, and much like Louis, who was 18 years previously, didn't get nowhere. Nowhere. Nope. Didn't even make a scratch. It probably did, but you know what I mean. So King Louis wasn't about to sit and allow Henry to achieve what he hadn't. And also, Count Raymond was kind of his brother-in-law, so he really should lend a hand. So would King Henry go up against the joint forces of the King of France and the Count of Toulouse? Would he? Would he really be that stupid? So Henry seeked the advice from his barons, including Thomas Becket. The barons advised Henry it would be stupid to attack their joint forces. It would be a disaster. Just don't do it. Don't do it. You know, raise the white flag. Now, Becket, he protested. He demanded that they go and attack the city immediately. Becket, he was outvoted and ignored. He was basically told, shut up, go and sit in the corner. And Henry II gave up the fight. Henry claimed that he wished to spare the French king and the city. That's why he gave up. Although it was, in fact, a failure, the whole thing did, though, begin to question Henry's relationship with his chief counsellor, Thomas Becket. Now, just a year earlier, in 1158, Becket had ridden at the head of a grand procession into Paris. The Chancellor of England had been sent on an embassy to negotiate the betrothal of Henry's 3-year-old son, Henry Jr., to Louis's baby daughter, Margaret. Thomas Becket was quickly becoming one of Henry's closest friends and a trusted advisor. Thomas had been working as a clerk at the for Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury, and Henry took Thomas from an unknown and rose him up to be the head of one of the most ambitious families throughout Europe. Remind you of another English chancellor? Also another Thomas. Anyway. So Thomas, he easily rose to the task and he excelled. Becket, he had just turned 40 and he had reached the height of his power in 1160. Thomas, he was tall and pleasant looking, slender. He had pale skin and a long nose, which I'm sorry, but I don't want to be, but it was what he was known for. He had a carefully learned manners and cultivated skills in a courtly conversation. His rise to power had been truly extraordinary. As well as Chancellor, he was Archdeacon of Canterbury, which in itself was an important position. So Henry, he really loved the differences between himself and his friend, and he liked to make fun of him. On one occasion, when they was riding through the streets of London in winter, Henry had spotted a beggar shivering in the cold. Now, Henry had mentioned to Thomas how nice it would be if that poor man had a nice warm cloak just to keep him warm over winter. And Thomas agreed it would be a lovely thing to do. Now, with that, Henry ripped off Thomas's brand new cloak, which was velvet and scarlet and all lovely, and there was a struggle. Both of them, it was like a tug of war with the cloak, but Henry won. And Henry gave Thomas's cloak to the poor man in the street. Now, Henry, he and his royal attendants had a great laugh. They thought it was hilarious, but because Thomas was, he was a snob. There's no other way of saying it. He was a snob. And he was very prideful, and because of that, he couldn't see the funny side of it. So, and Henry, he always loved to poke fun at Thomas, and anytime he had the chance, really. Henry was also known to ride into Becket's dining hall and jump from his horse to sit down to eat. And Henry found this hilarious. No matter how many times he'd done it, he never got bored of it. But despite all of the torments, all of the piss taking, basically, Thomas was in fact Henry's friend, and he was a trusted servant and confidant. In the 12th century, all over Europe, there was a struggle with kings and popes. There was the question over the jurisdiction and authority, and there were clashes over the right to perform coronations, the right to appeal to papal authority, then royal courts, and the rights for bishops to leave the country to attend conferences, the rights for kings to divorce their wives. And basically, they had to seek permission for pretty much everything. And almost every king had been or will be threatened with excommunication. Now, for goodness sake, excommunication basically meant being expelled from the church, and whatever your beliefs, being that you would be expelled to hell, you'd be sent to hell in afterlife. That's what excommunication means, basically. So as Henry's power and ambitions grew, in governing England, he knew that he would find it wouldn't be very popular with the church, basically. And Henry had felt that it was his right as King of England. He was prejudiced by an overpowering church, and he was determined for it to stop. Henry wanted more rights for himself as king and future kings within their realm. Henry didn't want to completely overpower the church. He wanted to be exact about his royal rights with him and his own lands and how to defend them. Now, Archbishop Theobald died on the 18th of April 1161 at Canterbury. Theobald, he had lived well into his 70s, and he had reigned as archbishop since he was appointed by King Stephen in 1138. Now, Henry, he was informed of the archbishop's death, and he immediately saw an opportunity. Henry had planned for the church's future. Henry wanted his son, also Henry, so Henry Jr., to be crowned as co-king, something that Theobald had completely refused to do, just as he had refused to do the same for Eustace with King Stephen. Now, in order for Henry to put those plans into place, he needed someone to act as archbishop who he could mold and basically do what he wanted. And he felt he wanted to redefine the boundaries of the rights that were between the church and the crown, and he wanted basically someone pliable who would listen to Henry and go, yes boss, I'll put that in place for you, no problem. And Henry really needed an ally within the church, so who better than his good old friend, Thomas Becket. Perfect. Right. Good idea, right? Yeah. So the monks of Canterbury, who held the right to elect an archbishop, thought Becket's candidacy was a joke. No. So Becket was unfit for the job. He had a second-rate academic background. He wasn't a lawyer, nor, also saying that, he wasn't even a priest. So how could he become archbishop if he wasn't a priest? And so it wasn't only the monks who thought it was a bad idea. Henry's mother, Empress Matilda, had written her concerns to her son, saying, don't do it. It's not a good idea. It's all gonna blow up in your face. Don't do it. But Henry didn't listen, because he didn't. Henry didn't listen. Henry, he thought there was going to be great advantages of having his best buddy as the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he ignored everyone's advice and concerns. And Henry wanted to pass his kingdom of England to his eldest son, Henry, who was turning 7. That was the age that they left their mother to begin their education into manhood. And in 1162, King Henry had his son taken into the care of Becket for tutorage, and more better if it was in the household of an archbishop. On the 2nd of June 1161, Thomas Becket was ordained as a priest, and the very next day he was consecrated as archbishop. To Henry, it was a brilliant triumph. His best friend was the Archbishop of Canterbury. What could possibly go wrong? And that's that. That's where I'm ending it. So you're going to have to make sure you come back for the next video so you know what happens. You know, remember when I said it's all going to slap Henry in the face? Henry's going to get a big old slap in the face. So make sure you join me, because it's going to get even better than this. It's going to get better. There's going to be more. There's going to be a lot more. And I'm not going to spoil anything. So you just have to make sure you join me for the next video. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and like and share and keep being brilliant, because you're all bloody wonderful. So there we are. Anyway, I'm going to go now. So enjoy the rest of your week, wherever you are doing it. Please look after yourselves, and I'll see you all soon.